Good afternoon, I'm Jason Obendorf, here today with former LAPD Assistant Police Chief and founder of the Pointman Leadership Institute, Bob Vernon, and his lovely wife, Esther. Thank you very much for joining us today. Chief Vernon, how would you summarize your 38 career in law enforcement? Maybe some highs and lows.
Number one, it was a wild ride and it was a fun ride. I enjoyed every bit of it. In fact, I've often said if I had to do it all over again, I would. I enjoyed every bit of it. But to be honest with you, the first 12 years were the most fun years. That's before I got into leadership. I was on the street doing what police officers sign up for, chasing bad guys, and doing the good things, helping people. Negative sides, you do get to see the shady side of life, on a constant diet. Every day you're called to the scene when things have gone wrong. So there was that downside, but the fulfillment overall was such that I loved every 38 years of it.
Now, how did you come to the place you are today as one of the most influential figures in law enforcement, character building, and ministry? And can you tell us a little bit about the Pointman Leadership Institute?
Yes, after I left LAPD, for maybe the last 10 years I was teaching at a California post, that stands for Peace Officer Standard Training, at a school on leadership. And so I got started teaching leadership while I was still there. And then I just kept doing it. I was called overseas, and through a fortuitous meeting, I can see now it was really an act of God. I met Stanislav Novotny, who was the head of all the police in the Czech Republic. I forget, 52,000 of them or something like that. And they were just coming out from communism, and they didn't have any basic ideology to undergird their leadership style. So I suggested to him, might you consider the Christian ethic and philosophy? He said I would if I could understand it. So I was invited to come over there. That's how it got started. It wasn't an idea of mine. It just was offered to me like that, and I think God was in it.
I was going to say that's a God thing.
I think it was.
Now,
I really do.
Today we want to kind of talk about the two worlds the officer is forced to live in. You have the work life and the home life. We're going to start with a little on-the-job stuff. Mm-hmm. Now, seeing that an officer sees the worst of people on a day-to-day basis, how do they maintain a positive attitude and keep from becoming too cynical on the job?
It's very likely that you have a tendency to become cynical because you only see people at their worst. On top of that, you see a lot of tragedy. You see a lot of death, a lot of dying, a lot of serious injuries, and you have to build up a defense mechanism so it doesn't hurt you emotionally and otherwise. And so you begin turning your emotions off. And so you're not only cynical, now you're calloused. And I've actually identified 13 other things that we won't go into now, but those kind of things that happen to you. And so you have to have balance. The way I got balance was, it sounds kind of weird in a way, teaching a Sunday school class. I taught a Sunday school class initially of about 4 boys, junior hires. Mm-hmm. We call junior hires pre-human. They're fun. I love them, but they're different. And every Sunday I taught them. And here were 4 young guys that were trying to get their heads screwed on right. You know what I mean? They had the right attitude. And so to contrast them with the kind that I was meeting on the street, I could see, hey, they're not all one kind. They're good kids, they're bad kids. There's the positive side of life. And working in the church, and that's just how I started. I worked up to other responsibilities at camps and summer camps and things like that. So the balance is really important. I tell officers who are not believers, who are not men of faith, well, if you can't teach a Sunday school class, coach a little league team. Do something
Be
positive.
a big brother or a big sister.
There you go.
Or a mentor or something along those lines.
Yeah, meet people in a positive context, not always negative. That's very important.
Now, in seeing so much tragedy and all of the drama that unfolds in the day-to-day life of an officer, a lot of guys, they tend to get burned out. How do you suggest that they come back and get that fire again that they maybe originally had when they first joined the force?
Well, first of all, what we just talked about will prevent the burnout from occurring. But once it happens, There's a couple things you can do. First of all, you need to talk about it with other officers that can understand, that have been on before. I had a partner, his name was Nick Nahara, and he'd been in the Battle of the Bulge in World War II, and he was senior to me by quite a few years on the department. I used to listen to him a lot, and he would help me cope with some of the stresses I was having. I talked to my wife a lot, Esther, and I didn't tell her everything, to be honest with you, because there were some things I thought, no one needs to hear this. I wish I hadn't heard it. I wish I hadn't seen it. So I surely don't want to put it on her. So to be honest, there were some things I kept from her, but about 90% I shared with her, and that was healthy for me.
So having some sort of accountability, both within the department, at least somebody to talk to, and then outside the department as well,
Yes.
With a spouse or some other loved one, would be a good thing to help kind of balance those things out and kind of refocus an officer?
Yeah, Jason, my dad was an LA cop ahead of me. And when I went on, he said, Bob, let me give you some advice. And he gave me several words of advice, but the one that I want to focus on here, he said, Bob, don't have all your friends be cops. He said, it's going to be natural to have some friends that are cops, because you work with them, you have the same interests, you understand one another, but consciously think about having at least 3 or 4 of your inner circle of 5 guys non-police. You need that other perspective where you don't get so ingrown that all you think of is the police perspective, and you don't think about how other people are looking at you and what you're doing and how you behave. That was good advice. And I always maintained some friendships, close friendships. In fact, my closest friend in the whole world that just passed away was not a cop. And we interacted together an awful lot.
And that kind of goes into one of the other questions I have here down the list a little ways, but I'll go ahead and ask it now. How does an officer keep from revolving their entire identity around being a cop?
That's really difficult, because it's a natural thing. I know there's a lot of jokes about this, but my wife will tell you, when we heard people joking about it, she said, that's what you do. We go into a restaurant, and I have to sit down where I can see the register with my back against the wall. I just have to do that, because if it gets held up, I want to know it's being held up. So hopefully I can do something and maybe stop some injury or death. And so there's a way that it invades not just your on-duty life, but your off-duty life as well. I got in a fight in a church parking lot one time, in my church parking lot, because a guy was breaking in a car. And it just happens that way. So it's real easy to become a cop, and that's your status. The way you fight against that, and hopefully the way, once again, you bring some balance, is you try to identify with some other skills and other gifts that you have. I mentioned one, teaching in the church. Another one, any kind of hobby or something that will get your mind off of just being a cop. I happen to like to run. It broke my heart when my doctor told me a few years ago, you're going to have to stop running. It's great for your heart, but it's really hard on your skeleton, you know. But Esther and I ran 3 miles every morning, 5 days a week.
Now, is there anything getting into the Word of God, and perhaps for some of those officers that are of faith, is there any positives to that can help pull that identity out of the department and put it back maybe where it belongs?
There's no question that the one factor that has not only helped us with my career, but us as husband and wife and best friends, is our relationship with the Lord. No question about that. And constantly going to church and being involved in small groups and things, and understanding what the Word of God says. There are principles there that can help you cope. The Bible's full of just amazingly practical principles that you can employ that will also give you that balance. I see myself, number 1, as a follower of Jesus. I see myself, number 2, as a cop. Or maybe number 2 as a husband.
Probably good. That's probably a good cover right there. Now, we've talked, these guys see crazy stuff day to day, shootings, robberies, the worst of the worst. And they expect that when they leave the department in the morning, they jump in the squad car and they expect to see the crazy stuff. What about some of the internal challenges the officers face within the department? Now, I'm talking about being passed over for maybe a promotion due to something political, or going above and beyond and have a supervisor maybe not notice or not care due to some sort of a personal vendetta. How should an officer cope with these kind of injustices within their own department where it's supposed to be a team? I know it's a struggle.
First of all, let me enlarge on what you've just said. As you indicated, I expect, and most cops expect, to get some heat from the bad guys, and sometimes even some heat from people who misunderstand what you're doing that are good people, but they're misunderstanding your role and whatever. You kind of expect that. The one thing I never expected, and it didn't happen to me early in my career, but near the end of my career, to have some people that I thought were my friends turn against me, stab me in the back. We were three of us competing for the chief of police job, and there was intense competition, and all of a sudden find out that I had some people who were not my friends and who were telling lies, and that was really hurtful. Esther can probably talk about that a little later on. And then for them to be joined by the press, who was really concerned about my Christianity. They came to me and said, does your Christian faith influence the way you work? And I said, well, I hope so. And they said, oh, you're admitting that your religion affects the way you work? And I said, yeah, I am. I hope that when I go to work, I tell the truth. I hope I keep my word. I hope I do more than just my 8-hour minimum. That's what I mean when I said my relationship with God affects my work. Not that I'm going around trying to hit everybody over the head with a Bible, but I hope my life shows that I'm consistent, I'm fair, and I'm a hard worker, and I'm doing my best. And they were a little disappointed to hear that, but the press was really concerned about me.
Now, in the line of duty, it's bound to happen for some officers, and most hope they'll never have to draw their firearm on the job. Do you have any advice, or how does an officer refocus after a traumatic experience like in an officer-involved shooting?
First of all, a lot of officers think that they shouldn't show any emotion, they shouldn't have any regrets, they shouldn't have any bad feelings about it. And they're the ones that quite often will get into trouble. I mean, in trouble, saying that they will have some unresolved guilt and feelings about it. Quick story, I came into my office and an officer was there at my desk that they had brought in while I was out. And he'd just been involved in a shooting and killed a man. And he was weeping. And I said, his name was Bob too, and I said, Bob, I heard about the shooting. My staff briefed me. He shot at you first. You had to defend yourself. It was necessary. You had to kill him. He said, I know, but I just killed a man. And he was just broken by it. That guy really fully recovered after we talked the whole thing through, But it's the guys that come in and say, well, I had to smoke that guy. But inside they're feeling the same feelings that Bob felt, but they're trying to be bravado, and it didn't bother me. Even though I had to do it, didn't bother me. It does bother every person to have to take a life. I don't care what they say. It bothers them, and they need to talk through it, and they need to recognize that sometimes it's absolutely necessary.
So you're recommending more of a kind of a psychological approach almost, and talking things through. I know a lot of officers who want to bury their emotions deep down will kind of go to other coping mechanisms to maybe deal with the guilt or maybe regret, some of those things that may be going on that they haven't talked through. And did you ever see that eat away at somebody and maybe destroy a career or have some serious negative consequences on their job or family life?
I have. I've seen some officers that have absolutely had to take a life. I mean, they had no choice, and they never could work the field again. We had to give them other kinds of jobs and eventually retire them because they just couldn't do it again. So that can happen. The officers who will open up and talk through it and listen to counsel from others we not only had full-time psychologists on the LAPD, but we had what we called a peer counseling program, where we had officers who had been involved in shootings that had been trained by psychologists to be peer counselors. And so that although they're not licensed psychologists, they had been there, they had done that, they had been through the trauma, they had worked through it, and now they were able to help someone else along. That's really important. And of course, if you're a man of faith like I am, everything like that you bring to the Lord in prayer and ask him to give you the peace and to be able to think through it with him and recognize that he's in charge. And if he's put you in that situation where it had to be done, he's going to walk with you through the debris as you pick up your life.
Now, some people are hard to communicate with unless you speak their language. I know in a lot of departments there are some jaded individuals who communicate best with swear words and other unbecoming forms of communication. As a man of God, as a Christian, man or woman, how do you go about communicating with these kinds of people when it doesn't seem like their values match yours, or they may not have any at all?
That's a real issue, and practically every new police officer has to face that. As a young officer, I was a believer before I became an officer. Okay, it wasn't that I was a policeman first and then became a believer. So when I first started working the street, I remember one partner having a conversation with me after I had been on maybe 4 to 5 months, something like that. And he said, I notice I don't hear you use any real tough language. And I said, no, I don't. He said, you mind telling me why? Are you religious or something? I said, well, I'm a follower of Jesus. Yeah, I believe in God. He said, well, look, at 3 o'clock in the morning, we pull 4 guys over in an alley, and we're by ourselves. You just don't say, get out of the car. You say, get out of the car. You know what I mean? And I said, well, I'll tell you what, I understand what you're saying. I'm going to pray to my God about this. And I'm going to ask him to give me the command presence to be able to do that without using those kind of words. And you know what? In a few months, I want you to come back and talk with me about this. And if you see that I'm letting you down and I'm not able to get those guys out of the car at 4 o'clock in the morning in a real expeditious way, we'll rediscuss this. He came back about 2 months later and he said, Bob, I can't explain it, but you do have a gift. You don't need to use bad language. Man, you get those guys out easy. People do what you ask them to do. I can't explain it, but some people call it command presence. You got it. You got it. And I just thank God for that, because I never did have to resort to that kind of language. The only time I used the bad language is when I was in court and had to testify precisely as to what someone said. And, I think God understands that.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
I'm acting like a recording, you know what I mean? I'm saying, here's what he said, and I couldn't clean it up. I had to say exactly what the guy said. But other than that, I didn't have to use it. It did not become necessary.
And I think you just gave some examples here, but that kind of leads into my next question is, what does it look like to be a man or woman of God and carry a badge? Paint us a picture.
Well, first of all, I think you have to earn the right to even talk about your faith. I didn't mention my faith for the first several months I was on, and they began asking me questions, like, hey, let's go out and have a beer. And I would go with them sometime, but I would have a Coke instead of a beer. And they would say, what's wrong with you? Don't you want to relax? And I try to explain to them, well, I got this relationship with God that I think is important. It's the most important thing to me, and I don't need to do that. They didn't understand at first, but I'll tell you how I got their attention. I got their attention by doing my absolute best at being a cop, not just being a guy that responded to calls and did what he had to do. We would go out looking for the bad guys before they committed a crime. We were doing what in LAPD is called OBS police work, observation. Mm-hmm. And that's the kind that is the most valued in LAPD. That was the thing that got you invited to go work an FCAR, which I got invited to do. There's only one FCAR per precinct out there. And Nick Naher and I worked the F car. And we averaged about 35, 40 felonies a month. And guys couldn't believe it. How do you guys do that? Once that was achieved, then it was easy to talk to people about my relationship with God. But I kept quiet about my relationship with God until I had earned their respect. I think that's extremely important.
I would agree with that. Now, as your career kind of progressed and more people knew about your faith, you mentioned the media. How did you deal with it when people internally would throw your faith in your face, because it was bound to happen? I'm sure it did over the years. How do you do that and then carry on that relationship with the person you have to see every day?
Well,
without a grudge.
Yeah, it was difficult. And like I say, this didn't happen really. It probably happened more than I knew about as I was coming up. But once I got to the very top, it became real obvious because there was no more concealing it. It was just blatant. It was out front. And that was difficult.
Well, Esther, let me ask you this. He probably shared a lot of that stuff with you. And, as a loving spouse, we're bound to stand up and want to defend our mate at all costs. How did that kind of work for you, and how were you able to kind of get through that without wanting to pull them out of the department and say, this is not where you belong, they don't love you, they don't understand you? Just tell us about that.
Well, it was a difficult thing, and I think as I look back on it, I can see where I made some mistakes. At first, I was running around trying to put all the fires out, trying to correct all of the lies, trying to defend my man. And that would be in the secular world. That would be my grocer, my meat man, wherever I did business, at the cleaners, my neighbors. I was running around and saying, do you believe what you're hearing? So I started out wrong. But I learned gradually, I figured it out, that my most important part was to pray and ask God for strength for him and myself. I shed a lot of tears, but I knew where my strength came from, and that was a key, to pray, and it helped me a great deal. Also found a few Christian friends that I could confide in, but not very many, that I took into my confidence to support my position. It was very difficult. It was the hardest thing I ever faced.
I can imagine so. Knowing that you have a good man and that people are trying to pull his character down at all possible points probably took some real spiritual maturity and a lot of angst to get through.
Quick story.
Yeah.
We went to this dinner with all the city council of L.A., all the muckety-mucks, and the mayor and the city attorney, and everybody was there. It was in this huge mansion of a house out in West LA, and the city councilman that had been causing me the most trouble politically came late, and guess what? The only chair available was at our table. And as he started to sit down, he pulled out his chair, and as he started to sit down, a lightning bolt struck right outside the window, almost broke the window. I mean, it was that close. And he said, "Whoa, did you see that?" And she said, "Well, what else do you expect, the way you treat my husband?" Right in his face. This is the city councilman.
Somebody's been watching.
Did he have a response to that? Most politicians are quick with a comeback. I can't imagine.
He didn't know
there
what
was
to
much
say.
to say there.
Not that time, but he had other responses earlier. Yes.
Well, we've touched on the officer side of things. Now I want to bring things back to the home front. And it's kind of where it really matters. We know that the divorce rate for police officers is exponentially higher than the divorce rate for secular couples or people out of the law enforcement field. What do you attribute that to?
First of all, I think the single one thing, there were a lot of things, of course, that fit in, but I mentioned earlier our relationship with the Lord is really the foundation of everything that came good of our relationship. But one practical thing that I would recommend to all married couples is every night for our entire marriage life, just before we would get ready to go to bed, we would read a passage from Scripture and pray out loud together, not just silently. And we just had a system that we still use where Monday night's her night, Tuesday night's my night. We go back and forth, so we each get a chance, you know. And I mean, and we pray. You know, there's a lot of practical things there. First of all, I believe in the power of prayer. You know, prayer unlocks the power of Almighty God. But in addition to that, the Bible says, don't let the sun go down on your anger. You know, I couldn't, in clear conscience and without feeling like a hypocrite, say to Esther, now shall we pray, when I've just yelled at her and called her something, you know what I mean? It just doesn't match. And so I found myself many times having to say, well, before we pray, let's get this straight between us, you know. And we've had to sit down and talk, and I've had to say, would you forgive me for raising my voice? I shouldn't have done that, you know. You were just
Did you forgive him?
Oh, of course.
But
Yeah,
but that practical thing of getting things straight before the sun goes down and reading the scripture together and praying, I think that single one act was the most powerful in our relationship of these 59 years.
And
Now-
a determination, excuse me, and a determination from the very beginning that there was no option, that marriage was permanent. And there was no problem with that. We both were in agreement on that subject.
Now, for the officer who has had a rough day, been on a homicide scene or a real bad traffic accident, maybe witnessed some child abuse, and then he goes home or she goes home, and the spouse's biggest concern is, why wasn't the trash taken out that morning before you left for your shift? How would you recommend an officer would process that without maybe letting a few choice words go?
I'll give you the first word.
Well, I have to admit, when each of the couples are exhausted by the end of a day, those kinds of things can get in the way of a really close, wonderful relationship. But you can't let that happen. And I've caught myself, and I've learned a lot in the years that have gone by, that I pick up the slack when he can't do something as much as I can, including taking in the trash.
I remember one particular incident where our daughter was about 13 years old, and I was sitting on the edge of the bed upstairs talking with her about something, and all of a sudden she said, Daddy, stop it. You're not talking to me anymore. You're interrogating me. And I suddenly had to realize, you know what? She's right. I was using interrogation techniques on my daughter. And so I say that, and I tell that story to illustrate something, in that I had to consciously think in my mind, I've got different roles here and different hats that I wear. And when I'm at work, I have on my police hat. And when I walk in the door, I have other hats. I'm a husband. I'm a father. And it's a lot different being a father than a cop. I was being a cop to my daughter, and I hadn't put on my father hat. I had to start consciously think about changing my roles. And if you don't think that consciously, you can really get into trouble. You're taught how to use the authority role, the command presence that I talked about earlier. I worked hard at that. It works so good that you start using it around the house too.
Well, and that's completely understandable. What about seeing the worst in people all the time? What about being overprotective when your children got to the age where it was time for them to kind of get out on their own and socialize and do those kinds of things? Was it a challenge for you to let them go? I mean, especially in a city like Los Angeles, a lot of things go on there. How'd that kind of play?
It was hard. My daughter, when she got to be dating, about 16 years old or so, I would have the guys come up to the front door, knock at the door, and come in. And then I was probably a little too structured.
Thumbprint.
Almost.
I would have to, they would have to give me the whole schedule almost minute by minute. Okay, then we're going to a 20-minute show.
Quite that bad.
Not quite that bad. But, then we're going to the football game. Then we'd like to go over and get a hamburger after the football game. And I total it all that up, and I'd say, well, that equals 11. You're going to be here by 11. And oh, by the way, I would always happen to have left on my gun belt, with my extra ammo on, my handcuffs, and And my daughter would say, Dad, you've been home for an hour. Can't you take those things off? You're going to scare my boyfriend. And I said, that's exactly how it's intended. Unfortunately, I was a little overprotective.
And I think there may be another side to that too, with some officers who, they're out every day and they, are witnessing crimes and they're seeing how other people's kids are acting. So when they come home and, maybe mom is wanting them to be disciplined and dad's kind of blows it off like, yeah, you don't see how other people's kids are acting out there. How do they come to kind of a consensus there? Because in disciplining children can be a real big roadblock in marriage. And kind of seeing the worst in people and then, considering your child to be not quite that bad. Is that a danger to some officers, you think?
We came up with an agreement. I'll let you talk about it, our agreement on our raising our children.
Well, often, depending on the mood, he would come home, be the disciplinarian in big things. I usually handled the smaller things, the things that were every day. But when some major thing would come up, he would be the disciplinarian. That's where once in a great while, not very often, he would come down with an iron fist on something, and I wouldn't agree with that. But we had already talked about this, and we had said, we'll never disagree in front of the children. We'll try to excuse ourselves, get out, do something to separate ourselves so that we could talk about the situation and come to agreement on whatever the issue was. And it usually was something major when we would have this problem. And so that saved a lot of that kind of a situation where you don't want your children to see you disagreeing on their discipline.
We even would agree on occasion to let them know we disagreed and that we're going to have to get it straight. So they would know when we would leave the room on some occasions. They're not in agreement on this, but when we would come out, we would be. And that was important. It was important twofold. I think it's healthy for them to know that your parents don't always agree, but it's also healthy to see they have a way of resolving that and coming together in a united front. And so even though one of us may not completely agree with the other one, we're now in front of the kids, we're agreeing.
You're on the same page.
We're together. We're a united front. I think that was very secure for the kids to see that.
Now, being an officer or getting into leadership on the department, those kind of things are very time consuming. And a lot of times officers who are on call can be called away on a moment's notice and potentially miss some real once in a lifetime kind of events. I'm talking birthday parties, championship
Christmas.
Games, piano, all that stuff. How do you kind of pick up the pieces if you've had to walk away, or how do you prevent those kind of situations from happening?
I don't think they're preventative. I mean, I think that it's necessary. And I think as time has gone by in a family, as they grow up with a police father and family member, they understand the need that they go through, the problems that are faced by a police officer. And mom is the one, and dad too, of course, who have to make that explanation and help them to understand the problem. But, whenever you can do anything about it, it's always worked on. Bob always was the one that worked hard to be at the games that our son played in football and basketball, whatever it was. He worked very hard to support him and be there. And our daughter, too, she was in music, and so we'd go to her recitals and things like that.
I was working a job at the time my son was in his 4 years of football where it was somewhat flexible schedule. So I told my boss, I said, I will give you 2 hours for every 1 hour I take off if you'll give me permission to go to the games. And I'll have, this was the day of the beeper, way before the cell phone. Yeah, I'll have my beeper in case I'm needed, but I'm going to the game. But I promise I'll give you twice as many hours as I take. And I, of course, did. And he thought that was a good deal. So I didn't miss very many of my son's games. But there were some Christmas dinners and Thanksgiving dinners and things like that was called right out. I think the key thing there is to explain so they understand what's happening, the severity of it. In fact, I took my son when he was around 12 or 13 years old on an officer-involved shooting where he saw a man literally die in front of him. And wow, from that point on, he knew what Dad was going to. Oh, you have to go. Oh, I see. He knew how serious it was. Then I think that the next thing to do is to make up the time taken away from in the best way you can, and give him something in substitute for that Christmas time.
Did your son understand the deal you had made with your boss, or did you keep that to yourself?
Oh no, he knew all about it. Yeah. In
and
fact,
did he respect you more for it? I mean,
he
did that
loved
kind of bring
it.
you guys closer?
Every first huddle, when his team got the ball for the first time, I'd always see his head come out of the huddle and look toward the bleachers to see if I was there until he saw he's there. So that was really important to him.
Now we've talked about the kids. Let's talk about you two. 59 years you've been married. Is that correct?
59. And
I've heard people talk about your guys' relationship, and we've just met today for the first time. But I can see you have a love and admiration for each other that a lot of couples outside of law enforcement struggle to maintain for several years, let alone decades. What was your secret to marital intimacy when you were on the force? I mean, in light of duty, you have to turn your emotions off. How were you able to turn those back on when you came home to Esther at night?
That was really tough. I found myself turning off my emotions during the first 2 or 3 years because some things hurt too much and I didn't want to think about them. I didn't want people to get too close to me, and I started getting kind of that way about my family. And the incident that I remember the most is when our daughter was injured and Esther had to take her to the emergency room, and I got a call to phone the station, and when I called they said call this number. So it wasn't my home, so I called the number, and they said Lincoln Heights Receiving Hospital. I said, receiving hospital? I must have the wrong number. I'm looking for my wife. They said, who's your wife? I said, Esther Vernon. Oh, she's here. She's waiting for your call. So she got on the phone and told me about our daughter falling off. She was 2 years old. She fell off a little stool and hit her chin on a gas jet sticking out from the wall and cut it. And she had to maybe get a suture there. And at that time, they weren't sure it was going to be sutured or not. And she's telling me this, and I said, one stitch, right? She said, yes. I said, okay, what's for dinner tonight? That was my response. She said, what'd you say? And I was so stupid, I said it again. I mean, I had so turned off to my role of being a father that morning I'd handled a motorcycle accident where it took over 100 stitches to try to keep a guy's leg on. And one stitch didn't mean much to me, except this was my baby daughter. Big difference. So, the light went on, and so I started realizing I'm going to have to learn how to turn my emotions back on. And you know what? I can get tears at a good McDonald's commercial because I've learned how to have feeling again. It took a while. It took a few years. Those first 2 years were tough.
Do you have any recommendations, Esther, on getting to the heart of a cop husband and maybe how to, break down some of those emotional walls that they put up and then bring home with them?
I think that you have to understand what he's talking about as far as his lifestyle and what he's having to go through. And as I said before, I think that it's very important to listen and to feel out that emotional level that comes home at night after a big day like he goes through or had gone through at the time. When you can learn to understand and learn to see the emotional situation, then you have to make the adjustments to whatever that is. And I think the easiest and the best thing to do is to sit and listen and try to get them to tell you and talk. If they don't want to talk, of course that's not necessary. You don't push that kind of a situation. But it's really great to be able to be a part of his life in the police department, to be a somewhat partner. When he was first in the department, I used to turn the radio on. We had the ability to hear calls. It's not what they have today. You didn't hear the voice of the man in the car, but you could hear the people who were giving the calls in the car to him as he worked. And if he got a bad call, I knew the codes. I would stop what I was doing at home and pray.
She memorized all the codes.
Yeah.
And I used to take her down to the station and tour her, so she knew about police work, and she showed a big interest in it. And we had one advantage. She was a stay-at-home mom, and so she had the time to do that, to raise the kids and to listen to my radio and to pray for me when I needed it. When I was asking for backup and for an ambulance because shots had been fired, she would be on her knees praying about that. But she knew about police work, and she wanted to know more, and that was comforting to me to know that she knew.
Now, were there ever instances where she wanted to know and you didn't want to tell her, you wanted to kind of maybe not bring that stuff home with you? And then how would you deal with a situation or an instance like that? Because I know a lot of officers struggle with not wanting to bring the job home to a spouse who wants to know all about it.
I didn't keep too much from her.
No, he didn't.
I told her most of the stuff, but some of the child abuse cases and stuff, I didn't want to tell anybody. I wish I could press the delete button, I've got some images up there that I'll never get rid of, and I certainly don't want her to have those. So, there was a few things I kept from her. But
now, how did you go about when she was maybe pressing you, seeing that something was wrong, without creating conflict? And you, Esther, thinking that maybe Bob is trying to hold something back from you. And I think a lot of marriages within law enforcement, there can be a divide there, trust issues, all kinds of stuff. And so how do we keep couples from seeing those?
But I trusted this faithful man, and I knew his relationship with the Lord. And I didn't really push really hard to get, when I knew there's a limit line, and you can see it. Why should I put him through that? I think that's the sensitivity of a woman. A woman is sensitive with the emotions. And I think that's probably what helped me a great deal.
Were you ever fed up, Esther, with the police work?
No.
No. Bob,
Because I felt it was a calling of God. I felt that God had called him into the work. And I was supposed to be supporting what he did.
Chief, what would you say to officers and married couples out there within law enforcement who have a spouse who can't stand police work and is fed up with it, doesn't want anything to do with the subject? Do you have any advice?
There's usually some reason that exists. There's either the reason that the husband has, or the spouse, whoever it is, it's the police officer, has devoted an overly amount of their absolute commitment to the job and hardly any commitment to their family. That's usually what happens there. So my advice is make sure that you give as much, at least, commitment to your wife and family. I always try to actually give a little more to the family than the job. But there's a phenomena that occurs in my studies. I call it the Knights of the Round Table syndrome. And the reason I call it that is when I was a kid, we used to hear the lady down at the end of the street at the playground. She would read us from the Knights of the Round Table stories, And I always saw police officers as those kinds of people, champions to go help somebody. And as I got older and realized it wasn't quite like that, it was still a noble job. And in fact, when we talked about the job, that's how we would term it. We would call it the job. And if a cop ever says that, he's not talking about any other job. It's the job. And it's important. It's significant. It's not just making widgets. It's not just selling this. It's saving people's lives, And so it can become all-consuming. It's easy to get so committed to this job that everything else pales, including your family, including your own health. And so it's a danger. It's probably the most severe and dangerous one of the unique pressures that I've identified.
And that kind of leads me to this. An officer on the streets is hypervigilant. A shift takes an unusual toll on psychology and the body. And a lot of times when they get home, nothing sounds better than the recliner and the TV remote to disengage, to turn the world out and have some solitude. How do you get over that to stay engaged with the family, to keep instances like the one we were talking about just a minute ago from happening?
Mm-hmm. What did you see, Esther?
I didn't see an awful lot of that, although you did enjoy certain programs like Dragnet.
I
And
did.
some of these
I really did.
What was the other one
It sounds
called?
funny.
But
Adam
anyway,
12.
Adam 12.
all those
of
old
those.
ones, yeah.
He was still living it at home, enjoying it there. But I didn't see him hiding at all or wanting to pull himself away. I don't know how to.
One of the
Hey,
things
what
I
else to
used to
add?
do, I remember when Bob was pretty young, every time I'd come home, she wouldn't know exactly when I was going to arrive because of my job. She knew about what time I was supposed to get off, but sometime I'd be an hour late or so. So she would make the kind of dinner that was prepared, ready to put on the stove, but wasn't quite there. When I'd pull in, she'd get things started. So I knew I had maybe 20, 30 minutes. And I'd change into my grubbies real quick, and Bob and I would play a game of horse. And we would unwind, number one. Number two, Bob would start talking to me. Well, one thing I found is your kids, especially when you're a cop and you come home and say, well, what did you do today? They're thinking, he's in his cop role here. But if I'd come home and play horse with him, suddenly he'd start telling me what happened that day in between the shots, and we'd communicate. And it would also give me a time to kind of release my tension and make that difficult hook shot that my son just made. And I knew I had to keep it to stay in the game. So, doing things like that are relaxing and at the same time interacting with your family and not being by yourself.
And
important.
he was good at that. He was very good at interacting with the kids. I attribute a lot of the success of the children to this man here.
Do you have any memories, Esther, of him after a really hard day, and maybe where you saw him put on the dad cape and just kind of go above and beyond when you knew that he had a real rough one and was maybe going through some things at the department, and just kind of went above and beyond as dad?
I can't think of an incident, but it was very obvious that he valued his children and put them ahead of himself a lot. So I would say that he extended himself a lot, more than the average person would. But I think you have to determine that. I think that has to be a priority in your heart. It comes from your heart.
Chief, were there any instances where she specifically pulled you through a downtime?
Oh, you want to number a whole bunch of them? There were quite a few of them. When everything else is kind of falling apart and it's been a bad day. A fairly recent one, not too many years before I retired, I had to kick 3 guys out of the detective bureau that I liked all 3 of them, but they just had done some serious things that I couldn't let it go on. I had to put on my disciplinary hat, and I had to put them back into uniform, and one of them couldn't take it and quit. The other 2 had a hard time, but eventually came back. But when I got home that day, I'll never forget, she met me at the door, and she looked at me and she said, "What in the world happened to you today?" I guess I looked pretty bad because, believe it or not, something like that can be as hard as some kind of physical thing you've been involved in. But when things are looking bleak and you're feeling bad, to have a wife that says something to cheer you up, and hey, guess what I did? I baked your favorite apple pie tonight. Stuff like that. That's what really makes you go.
Esther, what advice would you give to a spouse who is married to an officer that may be having a difficult time, or comes home after an obviously rough day? What advice would you give them as to how you can have your teammates back and help pull them back up?
Well, I think one of the other factors about being an encourager, I think that's what I try to be as much as I can to him when things go bad. And I think that, as I said before, women have more sensitivity sometimes than the average, than a man might. men do too, but I'm just saying there's an extra added thing that women have that can, you feel the sensitivity and emotions of some situations. And I think that when you feel that they need a lift, you start doing whatever lightens the load. Sometimes it's humor. Sometimes it's just understanding, listening. Sometimes it's doing what you know that he likes a certain thing. You work really hard to make that available. And I remember one thing that I'll just throw in here. One of the things that happened, he ran for the position of chief of police. And so they had a testing. And finally, after weeks and weeks and weeks of the council trying, or whoever it was, the committee trying to decide who would be the chief, they chose another person, and he was number 2. So I knew this was something that he really had worked hard toward. And when he came home, I had made a great big sign on a butcher paper, I guess it was, that said, "We're number 2." And at that time, was it Avis Rent-A-Car?
Mm-hmm.
Always promoted their business with, "We're number 2. You're just as good as number 1, but you're number 2, it's okay." And that's what I presented him with when he came home. And things like that help.
Well, I like that.
Deal.
We're number 2. It's a team.
We're a team.
We've always been a
We're
team.
And I saw,
Yeah.
and I want to add one more thing before this is over, is say that I see the police department and people in it as a mission field for us to be an example before them to show God's love and concern for their lives and for their souls as well. And so I always look at it as I'm a missionary. I don't go out and talk a lot, but I try to live the way that we should.
Can I just add something, and it may end up on the cutting room floor, but I'll add it anyhow, is that Esther always participated as a partner in the job, where for the last 10 years I was on the department. Every year we had a Christmas party at our house for all the chief officers and all the commanders and many of the captains. And we would have 30, 35 people over at our house, at our private home, and have a sit-down dinner, and she'd do it all. And we'd have our grandkids do the serving. And that was a real ministry, because they could see we were a family. And these dinners became known as, and at first I think they were trying to make fun, but they became kind of endearing almost. They said, "Oh boy, we're going to have another Ozzie and Harriet dinner." Because the home, it was kind of idyllic for them to see our grandkids waiting on them and stuff like that. They just loved it. But she had a part of that. That took a toll on her. That was a lot of effort, but I felt not alone in the department. I had a partner that was backing me up and had my back. And I greatly appreciated that. Thank you, Dolly.
You guys are a beautiful couple. You really are. Do you have any final words of wisdom you'd like to impart on officer spouses or law enforcement families who might have an opportunity to watch this? We'll start with you, Bob, and then we'll let you.
Well, first of all, we begin with this and I'll end with it, and that is, make sure you center your relationship around a relationship with the Lord. That's really important. And his principles. And when his principles are employed in marriage, in parenting, or in working, in doing the best you can at work, I tell Christians, whatever you do, keep that Bible inside your desk where no one can see it until you start working good, because right now you're not working good. You don't need to show that Bible. So center your relationship around the Lord and around his principles. And then in your work just like you're working for God himself. Do your best. Give it 100%.
Esther, any final advice for spouses out there?
Well, once upon a time, we stood in the front of a church when we were first engaged and committed our lives to the mission field. And then the Lord opened the door for the police department, which was very unusual at the time. It was an interesting way in which he joined the police department. And we knew that was going to be our mission field. And that's how I have really looked at this whole thing. I think wives need to see this as a sacrifice to the Lord. We're living sacrifices. It's important that whatever we give up, we're dealing with God himself, and we're working to make it happen with our relationships so that he would be honored. And that means giving up a whole lot of personal things at times. Not always, but at times you do. And being willing to do that with a good attitude and saying, it's for you, Lord. It's not just for us, it's for you too.
Well, Esther, I want to thank you for walking by the Lord, for standing by your man, and being an example of what a godly woman can do in the life of a husband, and especially one who has a job so challenging as law enforcement. And you, Chief, for being a good example while on the force, and for going above and beyond for God. And then in a time of retirement where most law enforcement officers are on a lake somewhere with the fishing hat on, sitting in a 14-foot aluminum boat, you're out here still plugging away in that mission field that God has provided you the opportunity. And I think you've probably reached a lot of lives, and a lot of lives will be touched by your work for years to come. So thank you very much for
Jason,
chatting with us today.
Good talking with you.
Thank you.
Great
Thank
to be
you.
here.
Can we just throw one more segment?
Sure.
If we have flexibility,
I'll tell you what, I need my Kleenex.
Chief, do you have any advice for new recruits, guys that may be coming on the force or new to the force, that they may have a successful and fulfilling career in law enforcement, not only as officers and representatives of Christ, but in having a good home life as well?
Well, work on your marriage. Marriages don't just happen. Good marriages don't just happen. They require a lot of effort. Live within your means. You know, I find a lot of cops that I joined with went out and got all the toys that most men like to get, like ski boats and things like that. I never owned a ski boat. We didn't have a fifth wheel. We didn't have a lot of these extra things until we were just about retired, because we didn't want to have those credit card bills that we couldn't pay. And you have another stress like that on your marriage, and it's gonna make it harder. So we live within our means. The whole issue of being content with what you have and being happy, and not always being unhappy with your situation, and not being able to express your happiness over it. Esther, what would you say?
Well, yes, and then the wife putting pressure on the husband because she thinks she needs something more and she's not satisfied, and all of those things the discussion needs to be there, but the understanding also comes along with that, of understanding each other and realizing that though I want something very badly, doesn't also mean, it doesn't mean as well that I'll be pouting because I don't get it. I need to learn the contentment that you just mentioned. So the wife plays the important role in that as well. It's not just the husband, it's the wife too. She needs to learn to give.
Now, is it important for new recruits and rookies, those guys, to set parameters, kind of rules to live by?
They really should, and you should make your decisions on which way you're going to go, anticipating various kinds of situations you're going to be in. I remember an old timer. I was out of the academy just a couple of weeks, and I was working a drunk wagon, and we pulled up and we were loading some drunks, and a prostitute came out of one of the bars and started making eyes at me and everything. And I'll never forget this. I wasn't attracted to her, but I remember this old timer came up to me and he said, "Just remember this, officer, you're young, I could tell." And man, I still had my recruit look, with the clothed hair and all that. He said, "There's not a prostitute in this city that won't want to get you, but it's not you, it's your badge. You got to remember that, The little words of advice like that, and being the kind of man who looks at marriage as a commitment and not just a trial or a relationship that'll work for a while. I loved Esther so much that I decided if I ever get in a situation where I could go that way and have an extramarital affair, I'm deciding right now, I'm not going to do it. And I made that decision before the opportunity ever came up. I think it's important to do those kinds of things. Someone told me, and I don't know if this is correct or not, but someone said the man's biggest need is adequacy, to feel that he's adequate in providing for his wife, that he's adequate physically, he's adequate in every way. A woman's greatest need is security. And if an officer recognizes my wife needs this security, she needs a love that is demonstrated through my being able to make her secure, that's important too. That'll help hold that relationship together.